Привет, друзья! G'day guys, welcome to another Soviet lens review. Today, something a little bit different. We are going to be finding out which country made the better 50mm lens back in the day. Is it the USSR with the Zenitar ME1, or is the Japanese made 50mm from Yashica gonna be better? Let's get into it. So let's get into it. First off, the Zenitar ME1. Let's run through some tech specs for this Soviet 50mm. So this lens was made at the KMZ plant in the 1980s. You can check out my Zenitar ME1 review if you want to know more about it. But basically, it is a Soviet 50mm f1.7 wide aperture lens with a minimum focusing distance of 0.45 meters and an aperture that goes down to f16. Now, this does have a square aperture, but for the purposes of this test, we're not really going to be kind of comparing aperture shapes, because of course you could get the Zenitar without the square aperture in the standard M version. But aside from that, this lens is very comparable to the Yashica, not only in size and weight, but also in specifications. The only real difference on the specs sheet is that the Yashica here does have a 0.5 meter minimum focusing distance, so 5 centimeter difference with the Yashica only being able to focus 50 centimeters close in, as opposed to the Zenitar's 45 centimeters. But aside from that, these two lenses are very, very similar, even down to the filter thread. Now, both of these lenses are also M42 screw mount lenses. So what I've done is adapted them to my Nikon Z6 to get the photos you see in the review today with a Nikon M42 to Z mount adapter, and both of these lenses do adapt really, really well. And of course, it wouldn't be fair to compare two lenses from different countries if they were made in different times. So both of these lenses were actually made in the 1980s. The Auto Yashinon DSM 50mm 1.7 has a design that was a few years earlier than the Zenitar ME1, but by and large, both of these lenses were lenses that were kind of designed around the 80s period, slightly earlier for the Yashinon, and manufactured in the 1980s. So let's talk about lens ergonomics first off, because that's going to be the one real differentiator between these two lenses that you can immediately kind of tell right off the bat. So the Zenitar ME1, first off, my copy at least, the focus ring is a touch stiff and probably needs a service, probably needs a bit of lubrication. But having had multiple different KMZ lenses in the past, I can say that, you know, if you get one that has been properly serviced or at least cared for, then it's not going to have this issue. But I do have to say, I'm judging this review based on the copy that is in front of me, so I've got to take a little bit of a point off for the slightly stiff focus ring, particularly when compared to the Yashinon. Now the Yashinon, this one was made a little bit later than my copy of the Zenitar ME1, and the focus ring is very, very smooth, beautiful rubberized grip there, and it is a real pleasure to handle. You might maybe say that it's a little bit too easy to turn, but personally I've found this focus ring very easy to work with, and I've got to say I do prefer it over the Zenitar ME1s, so that's actually a point to the Yashica. Next up, let's talk about lens sharpness. Now this is going to be a tough one. I have shot a lot of photos with the Zenitar ME1, a few less photos with the Yashinon, but I really do feel as though after having shot so much with the Zenitar and quite a bit for the Yashinon for this review, I can safely say that the Zenitar is that slight bit sharper. It has more micro contrast, and where you're really going to see that is particularly towards the edges of the frame at f1.7, where the Yashica lens is certainly a little bit soft out at those frame edges at f1.7. The Zenitar ME1 retains a level of sharpness that is comparably modern when you're looking at it side by side. So sharpness wise, that means that's a point for the Zenitar ME1. Next up is bokeh. Now, we're not going to compare the aperture shape, because that wouldn't be fair. The Xenitar ME1 does have a square aperture shape, but we're basically going to be comparing the quality of the bokeh. How smooth are those out of focus areas? How smooth are the out of focus highlights? What do they look like between both of these lenses? And I've got to say, this is one of the hardest things to compare and evaluate, because I love the Xenitar's bokeh. It's got that characteristic KMZ sort of, really, really plasticky 3D look that, almost reminds you of a Carl Zeiss lens in how well it can separate a subject from its background. Whereas the Yashinon, it does have a very beautiful bokeh, very circular, of course, not being a square aperture, but the out of focus highlights are not too busy. And I think bokeh is one of the Yashica's lenses' strong points here. So I actually think I am going to give it to the Xenitar ME1 because what you'll see in these photos here is a little bit of longitudinal chromatic aberration in the Yashica when you're comparing it to the Xenitar in particular. It is very minor, but we're pixel peeping here, and that's the only real thing that we've got to go on. So I think that because that this Yashica lens has a little bit more longitudinal CA, we do have to give the bokeh or quality of out of focus areas in the image to the Xenitar ME1. Next up is flaring. So you might be able to see both of these lenses, they do have a multi-coating, of course. MC is actually what the multi-coating stands for, or MS in Cyrillic, in fact, on the Xenitar ME1, and the Yashica also has a multi-coating. Now, any fans of Soviet lenses will know that the Soviet multi-coatings really weren't too great at actually preventing flare from affecting the image, and that definitely manifests itself in the Xenitar as well. You are not going to get a flare-free image, particularly when you're shooting it wide open, and light potentially can become a problem. I really do have to give the point here to the Yashica, just because it has a much more controlled, flaring light source. It has a much more controlled image when you put light into it. Now let's talk about chromatic aberrations. And this for me is an easy one, because you are going to be seeing a lot of chromatic aberration on the Yashica when it is at f1.7. If you put the Yashica wide open against a very high contrast background, some backlight, some sunlight, the sky behind the subject of your image, then you're going to get a lot of issues with the Yashica. And that's going to manifest itself in some particularly blue color fringing and almost ghosting a little bit as well. It's not a very pleasing image. Whereas the Xenitar, although it does struggle with flare, chromatic aberration is actually very well corrected, and in my mind, never an issue that kind of ruins an image. Whereas with the Yashica, I've shot a lot of photos with it in DX and FX full frame format, and there are some times when you're shooting at f1.7 and the scene is just a little bit too high dynamic range for the Yashica to handle, and the chromatic aberration might ruin your image. So in terms of chromatic aberration, I've got to give it to the Xenitar there. That's another point for the Soviet lens. So let's talk about color and just general image reproduction, how these lenses end up looking when you take a photo with them. And first off with the Xenitar, I've got to say, I love the image that the Xenitar creates. It is modern with a little bit of a vintage feel. The colors all feel very, very natural. And what I like potentially most about the Xenitar ME1's image is that it really does highlights and shadows well. The highlights, they're almost going to be, dodged a little bit in lens, I want to say, particularly when you look at this image here. Whereas the Yashica, I feel as though the highlights and the shadows, they sort of blend a little bit together, you know, somewhat. They aren't quite as contrasty, or they aren't as pleasing to me personally, at least. Now, this is a very subjective thing, but what is not subjective is the color cast for both of these lenses. So the Zenitar ME1 does have a slightly cooler color cast, which personally I shoot on Nikon, and I kind of prefer the slightly cooler image that the Zenitar ME1 produces. The Yashica lens here, it does produce a slightly warmer image, and a lot of people have reported that when using this particular lens, because they did use thorium glass in it, which can kind of turn yellow over time. My lens does not have that issue, so it's not a kind of time issue with the lens just turning yellow. I think it's just the color cast of the Yashica is naturally just a touch warmer, certainly not so much that it ruins the photo. But I really have to say that because of just the slightly more finished look, I feel, that the Zenitar ME1 gives the images that I take with it, I have to give this point for color and general image reproduction to the Zenitar. Now, in terms of price, this one is an easy one because the Yashinon here is a fairly cheap lens, you know, $100 or so should be more than enough for you to pick it up on eBay, whereas the Zenitar ME1, well, it is a bit of a rare one due to that square aperture, and that means that, yeah, it's going to cost you a little bit more. So the point here definitely goes to the Yashinon for affordability. Now, you can actually get yourself a Zenitar ME without the square aperture, and that's going to be a lot cheaper, a lot more in the ballpark of the Yashinon, but at the end of the day, I've got to be fair here, so a solid point to Yashica. Now, when it's all said and done here, we've got the Zenitar out in front with 4 points, and the Yashinon ends the battle on 2 points. So, round of applause for our Zenitar ME1, the Soviet 50mm, for taking out this little lens duel between it and its Japanese counterpart, the Yashinon. Now, guys, I have tried here to make this comparison as fair as possible. You know, try to get two 50mm lenses, both f1.7, both made around the same time. But at the end of the day, of course, you know, different lenses made from different manufacturers, even different factories within the same country, are going to be different. So although the Zenitar ME1 has come out in front in this little kind of review, it doesn't necessarily mean that every lens made in the USSR, it was better than every lens made in Japan. Of course, we're not saying that. Of course, that's not true. But it has been a lot of fun to look at both of these ones, I think. And yeah, I've had a lot of fun. So if you want me to, you know, do another one of these, maybe with a different focal length, 35mm, 135mm, let me know in the comments down below. But for now, if you have enjoyed this video, leave it a like, thumbs up, and subscribe to Soviet Lens Reviews for more content just like this. But until the next time, I'll see you then.